There is a version of you that the world knows. It shows up to work, to social gatherings, to family dinners, to every context that requires you to be something legible and acceptable and functional within the expectations of the people around you. It knows how to present. It knows when to speak and when to be quiet, when to project confidence and when to perform humility, when to show warmth and when to demonstrate edge. It has learned, through years of refinement and social feedback, exactly what version of you is most likely to be received well in which environment. It is in many important ways competent, effective, socially intelligent, and it is not you. Carl Jung called it the persona. He borrowed the word from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The masks that announced the character to the audience before a word was spoken. He chose that word deliberately because what he was describing was a performance, not a malicious one, not a consciously constructed deception in most cases, but a performance nonetheless. A functional face assembled over years of socialization, shaped by what was rewarded and what was punished, by what generated connection and what generated rejection, by what your family needed you to be, what your peers needed you to be, what each new environment you moved through needed you to be, assembled so gradually, so naturally, that most men arrive at midlife wearing it so completely that they have genuinely forgotten there is anything underneath. And this is where Jung's insight becomes something more than psychological theory. It becomes horror. Not the theatrical kind, the quiet, creeping horror of a man who has spent years, sometimes decades, building and maintaining and defending a life organized around a version of himself that was never fully real, who has made his closest relationships, his career, his self-image, his very sense of purpose dependent on the continuation of a presentation that costs him more every year to sustain, who feels beneath the competence and the function and the social smoothness a specific kind of exhaustion that has no obvious source. Because the source is not visible. It is not a problem he can point to and fix. It is the accumulated weight of never quite being in full contact with himself. The fatigue of performing continuously for an audience that includes the people in his own mind. This video is about that horror and what lies on the other side of it. Because Jung did not stop at the diagnosis. He mapped the entire territory, including the path through. And the path through is not comfortable. It is not a matter of reading the right books or adopting the right framework or even working with the right therapist, though that can help. It is a matter of being willing to look at what the mask has been covering, at the rejected parts, the unacknowledged parts, the parts of yourself that did not fit the persona and so were pushed down, walled off, denied for so long that they feel like strangers now. And that looking, if you are willing to do it honestly, is the beginning of something that most men never manage to reach, an actual life, not the performance of one, the thing itself. If this is the kind of work you are here for, genuine, philosophically grounded, unflinching examination of what it means to build an authentic life rather than a performed one, subscribe. Because everything on this channel is built toward exactly that. The birth of the mask. The persona does not appear fully formed. It is constructed piece by piece in response to the specific pressures of a specific childhood in a specific family, inside a specific culture with specific demands about what a man is supposed to be. Jung understood that the persona is not fundamentally a bad thing in its origins. The young child who learns to suppress his anger in environments where anger is dangerous is not being dishonest. He is adapting intelligently to conditions he cannot control. The boy who learns to hide his sensitivity because his environment treats sensitivity as weakness is not lying. He is protecting himself with the tools available to him. The adolescent who discovers that a particular presentation generates acceptance and belonging, is not a manipulator. He is a social animal doing what social animals do. The problem is not the initial adaptation. The problem is what happens when the adaptation outlives the conditions that made it necessary. When the boy becomes a man but carries forward, unchanged and unexamined, every suppression and every performance that served him at 7 but constrains him at 35. When the learned face becomes so habitual, so automatic, so identified with as the self, that the man has genuinely lost the thread back to what was underneath it before the adaptation began. When the mask that was built for survival becomes the prison that prevents flourishing. Jung observed that the more complete and polished the persona, the more completely the man behind it has been hollowed out. Not always, not as an absolute rule, but as a consistent pattern across the thousands of men and women who sat across from him in analysis. The men whose presentations were most seamless, most socially functional, most comprehensively maintained, were often the men most profoundly disconnected from any genuine sense of their own interior life. They had become their roles: husband, executive, father, provider, leader, each role carrying its own sub-persona, its own required presentation, its own set of emotional performances. And the sum of those roles, however impressive and however successfully inhabited, did not add up to a person. It added up to a set of functions. And somewhere beneath those functions was a man who had not been seen, perhaps not even by himself, for a very long time. Marcus Aurelius, who understood the weight of role-wearing perhaps better than any man in history, spent his private journals actively working against the merger of his identity with his position. He was emperor. He was expected to perform empire in every public moment of his life. And yet, in his private writing, he returned again and again to a set of questions that have nothing to do with empire. Am I actually virtuous or merely appearing so? Am I acting from my real values or from the expectations of my role? Is what I did today something I would endorse if stripped of every audience? Those questions are not the questions of a man who has confused his mask with his face. They are the questions of a man doing the daily, unglamorous work of remaining in contact with himself beneath the presentation his life required. That practice, sustained across decades of genuine external pressure, is one of the most extraordinary examples of what Jung was pointing at as the alternative. The man who wears the necessary mask and knows he is wearing it, who can set it down in private and make contact with himself beneath it, is fundamentally different from the man who has forgotten the setting down is possible. The shadow. What the mask covers here is where Jung's framework becomes most uncomfortable and most essential, because the persona does not exist in isolation. Every quality that goes into the persona, and every characteristic that gets presented, approved, and identified with as self, has a counterpart. Everything you decided, consciously or not, was too dark or too weak or too unacceptable to be part of the presentation. Everything that was criticized, punished, shamed, or simply never welcomed in the environments that shaped you, that material does not disappear. It cannot disappear, it goes underground. Jung called it the shadow. The shadow is not your evil. It is not the worst of you, though it can contain genuine darkness, if that darkness has been long denied. It is your unexplored wholeness. Everything about you that did not fit the particular shape the persona took. The sensitive man who built a hard exterior because softness was not safe carries his sensitivity in shadow. And it erupts sideways in unpredictable emotional reactions that he cannot explain or control. The man who built his persona around competence and capability carries his vulnerability and his need for help in shadow, and it surfaces in the specific bitterness he feels toward people who openly need things he has never allowed himself to need. The man who built his identity around being good, around being the responsible and reliable and morally upstanding version of himself, carries his anger, his selfishness, his desire for chaos and freedom and transgression in shadow, and it comes out in the fantasies he is ashamed of, in the resentments he cannot justify, in the sudden destructive impulses that feel alien and threatening, precisely because he has never made honest contact with the part of himself they come from. This is the first dimension of the horror Jung was describing. Not that you have a shadow. Everyone has a shadow. The shadow is simply everything that was not included in the persona. The horror is what happens to it when it is denied rather than integrated, because the shadow, unexamined and unacknowledged, does not simply sit quietly in the dark. It generates, it drives, it shapes your decisions and your relationships and your reactions in ways that feel external, feel like things happening to you, feel like fate because you have no conscious access to the interior source. You are being run by the parts of yourself you have refused to see. And Jung's most devastating statement about this process is the one that ought to keep every serious man awake. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That phrase is worth sitting with until it lands. Every pattern in your life that you have not been able to explain, every relationship that has followed the same template despite your best intentions, every self-sabotage that arrived just when things were going well, every inexplicable resistance to things you consciously want, every attraction to people who are demonstrably wrong for you, every recurrence of the same conflict in different contexts with different people. These are not mysteries. They are the shadow expressing itself through the only channels available to it. The unconscious behavior patterns, the projections, the reactions, the compulsions of a man who has not yet been willing to look at the whole of what he is. The mechanism of projection. There is a specific way the shadow makes itself visible that Jung documented with extraordinary precision, and understanding it is one of the most practically useful things a man can take from Jungian psychology. It is called projection, and it is happening in you right now, in relationships you currently maintain, in judgments you currently hold, in the people and qualities that irritate, repel, or fascinate you beyond what any rational account of those feelings would justify. Projection is the mechanism by which the contents of your shadow are experienced as qualities in other people rather than as qualities in yourself. The man who has denied his own ambition will find himself enraged by the ambition of others. The man who has suppressed his need for approval will feel contempt for people he perceives as approval-seeking. The man who carries unexplored rage will see aggression in others that no one else quite registers. The man who has denied his own capacity for dishonesty will be triggered by dishonesty at a level of intensity that exceeds the apparent offense. What triggers you most strongly in other people, what produces the strongest and most disproportionate emotional reactions, is almost always carrying information about your own shadow. This does not mean that the quality you are reacting to is not present in the other person. Often it is, but the intensity of your reaction, the hook that it finds in you, the specific way it gets under your skin and stays there, that is yours. That belongs to the interior territory you have not yet explored. Jung used a precise image for this. He said that projection is like the light of a cinema projector. The light is coming from inside the machine, from you, but it is thrown outward onto the screen, onto the people around you, and you sit in the audience watching the show and believing it is happening out there rather than originating in the source you are sitting next to. This mechanism is responsible for an enormous amount of human suffering that would be completely unnecessary if people could see what was generating it. The man who cannot be in the same room as his brother without the encounter escalating into conflict is not simply a man with a difficult brother. He is a man carrying something in his shadow that his brother's particular qualities or behaviors are consistently activating. The man who cannot stop thinking about his former colleague who he believes has been unjustly promoted is not simply a man with accurate perceptions about injustice. He is a man whose relationship to his own ambition and his own sense of deserving has not yet been brought into full conscious view. The man who is magnetized again and again to relationships with a specific kind of person who ultimately disappoints or damages him is not simply unlucky. He is being drawn by his shadow toward the precise relational pattern that carries the specific quality or wound he has not yet been willing to examine in himself. The productive response to recognizing projection, and it is one of the most difficult responses imaginable because it requires you to turn the attention completely around, is to ask, what does the intensity of my reaction to this quality tell me about my relationship to this quality in myself? Not defensively, not as self-accusation, with genuine curiosity, because the answer to that question, engaged honestly, is never comfortable but always illuminating. It is always pointing at something real, at a place in your interior life where the territory is unexplored and where the exploration, though difficult, would return something genuinely valuable to you. Epictetus said that the goal of philosophy is not to explain the world, but to examine the one doing the explaining. Jungian psychology says something structurally identical. The goal is not to understand why other people are the way they are. It is to understand why you react the way you do. And the understanding of that reaction, taken all the way back to its source in your own interior life, is where the real work and the real liberation lives. The performance, no one scheduled an ending for here, is a specific dimension of the mask's horror that most discussions of the persona understate. The performance has costs that compound invisibly over time, costs to your energy, to your creativity, to your capacity for genuine intimacy, to your ability to think clearly about your own life and make decisions that are actually in alignment with who you really are rather than who the persona requires you to be. These costs are not always dramatic. Often they arrive as a kind of chronic low-level depletion, a flatness that descends on things that should feel meaningful, a restlessness that doesn't respond to the obvious remedies, a sense that you are going through the correct motions of a correct life, and that none of it quite reaches something inside that you cannot name but cannot stop being aware of. Jung called this the midlife crisis, but he did not mean it in the dismissive cultural sense. He meant something precise and serious. The first half of life, he observed, is naturally organized around the building of the persona, the establishment of identity in the social world, the construction of career, relationships, family, status, the external structures through which a man makes himself known and through which he comes to know himself. These are legitimate developmental tasks. They are not mistakes. They are necessary. But they are not the whole of what a human life is for. And the man who arrives at midlife having succeeded entirely at the tasks of the first half, who has built everything the persona required and found that the building of it did not produce what he expected it to produce, that man is standing at the threshold of what Jung considered the real work. The second half of life, in Jung's framework, is about individuation. The word means, literally, becoming undivided, the process of recovering and integrating the parts of yourself that were left behind in the construction of the persona, the process of making the unconscious conscious, of meeting the shadow with enough honesty to stop being run by it, of developing a relationship with the deeper layers of yourself that the persona has been covering over and that have been, all this time, trying to get your attention through the symptoms you have been dismissing as stress or circumstances or the ordinary unhappiness of adult life. The man who refuses this work, who doubles down on the persona when it starts to feel hollow, who builds more of the external structure when the internal hollowness is the actual problem, will be delivered to the same threshold by increasing force. The body will speak if the mind won't listen. The relationship will crack if the pretending can't hold. The career that felt like purpose will start to feel like a cage. The life that looked from the outside exactly like what it was supposed to look like will begin to feel from the inside like a structure that was built to house someone else. Because it was built to house the persona. And you have been living in it while the self that the persona was built to protect and present has been waiting with the patience of everything that exists outside of time for you to come back to it. The specific horror of high functioning. There is a version of the masked life that is particularly worth naming because it is the one most likely to go unaddressed. It is the life of the high-functioning man, the man who has built his persona so effectively that it produces objectively impressive results. The career is genuinely successful. The relationships appear genuinely healthy. The social presence is genuinely engaging. The life, seen from any external vantage point, looks like a life well constructed and well lived. And yet something is wrong, not visibly. Not in any way he can fully articulate or justify, given the evidence available from the outside. Just wrong in the way that a house can have a structural problem that is not visible in any individual element, but that you can feel in how the whole thing settles when you move through it. This man is the hardest to reach because the success of his persona functions as a continuous argument against the necessity of looking beneath it. What is there to examine when things are going this well? What is the problem that needs solving when the metrics suggest no problem, and so the quiet wrongness remains quiet? It gets attributed to other things, to stress or season or the ordinary dissatisfaction that everyone surely feels to some degree. It becomes background. And the man who has built a high-functioning life on a persona he has never examined is running a risk that his level of external success is specifically designed to make invisible. That when the structure finally does crack, and it always does, it will crack at a foundation level rather than a surface level, and the reconstruction required will be proportional not to the surface problem, but to the depth of what was never built honestly in the first place. Jung's observation about this was one of his most unsparing. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The word privilege is doing important work in that sentence. It signals that the process is not given freely, that it has to be chosen deliberately, say against the considerable pull of a life organized around the persona that is working perfectly well by every available measure. That choosing it requires a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with external bravery, the courage to be genuinely uncertain, to not know who you are beneath the mask for a period of time while you are in the process of finding out, to sit with the discomfort of a life that is being reorganized around something more fundamental than the social presentation that has been running it. That discomfort is real. The period of genuine individuation, of honest shadow work, of the gradual dismantling of the persona's monopoly on your sense of self, is not comfortable. It tends to disrupt things. Relationships that were based on the persona's requirements become strained when the persona is being questioned. Now, careers built on the performance of a particular self can feel destabilized when that self is being re-examined. The people in your life who were comfortable with the mask, who perhaps preferred it to whatever might be underneath, will sometimes resist what they experience as a change in you. And you will be tempted, repeatedly, to put the mask back on, to return to the comfortable performance, because the performance, for all its costs, at least has the familiarity of something that has been working. But here is what is on the other side. And this is what Jung, for all his unsparingness about the difficulty of the process, never let his readers forget. What is on the other side of the mask is not chaos. It is not the destruction of what you have built. It is not even necessarily a dramatic transformation visible from the outside. What is on the other side is contact with yourself as you actually are. The strange and specific relief of not having to maintain the performance. The energy that returns when it is no longer being spent on the management of a presentation. The quality of presence that becomes available in relationships when you are no longer showing up as the persona, but as the person. The creativity that gets liberated when the shadow is no longer absorbing so much of your vital energy in the effort to stay suppressed. The clarity that descends when you stop being driven by unconscious material and begin, slowly, to move from actual choice. The shadow's gifts. Here is what no one tells you about the shadow work that Jung prescribed, and it is the thing most worth knowing before you are willing to do it. The shadow is not only, or even primarily, the dark material you are afraid of. It contains everything that was left out of the persona, and because the persona, by necessity, represents only a portion of your full human range, the shadow contains parts of yourself that are not dark at all. Parts that are vital, creative, powerful, tender, wild, deeply intelligent, playful, passionate, and genuinely alive in ways that the persona cannot be, because the persona must remain legible and acceptable to its various audiences. The shadow contains your authentic genius and your authentic passion alongside your authentic darkness. And accessing one means being willing to access the others, because they are stored in the same territory. The man who built his persona around competence and emotional control will find in his shadow not just his emotional neediness and his fear, but also his tenderness, his capacity for genuine vulnerability that could deepen every relationship in his life, his access to the creative and intuitive dimensions of his intelligence that function poorly under the rigid management of the controlled persona. The man who built his persona around being good and reliable and responsible will find in his shadow not just his anger and his selfishness, but also his aliveness, his capacity for spontaneity, his ability to say yes to things that have no justification beyond the fact that they are genuinely, fully wanted. The man who built his persona around strength and self-sufficiency will find in his shadow not just his terror of dependence, but also his capacity to receive, to let other people actually be present to him, rather than performing strength for an audience of one. Seneca wrote that the man who is always strong is exhausted, and the exhaustion itself is a kind of weakness. There is a freedom in the integrated self that the persona cannot access, because the persona must always be guarding the edges, always maintaining the presentation, always managing the possibility that what is underneath might show through at an inconvenient moment. The integrated man has no edges to guard. He has brought what was underneath into his conscious life, metabolized it, related to it, given it appropriate expression rather than allowing it to operate as an autonomous force he cannot see or direct. And the energy released by the cessation of that guard work is enormous. It does not all go to pleasant things. Some of it goes to facing truths that were being avoided, but it goes to real things, to actual life. And actual life, in Jung's framework, as in the Stoic tradition that predated him, is the only thing genuinely worth spending a life on. Making the unconscious conscious. So how does a man actually do this? Not abstractly, in practical terms, in the daily life of someone who does not have decades of analysis available to him, but who is serious about beginning the work of dismantling the persona and integrating the shadow. Jung would have said that the work begins with attention, not therapeutic attention specifically, though that is valuable. the fundamental attention of a man who has decided to take his own interior life seriously as a subject worth studying. It begins with the questions you ask yourself in private, not the rehearsed questions whose answers you already know, the genuinely uncomfortable ones. What am I performing right now, and for whom? What am I afraid would happen if I stopped performing it? What aspects of myself have I never given full expression to, and what have I told myself about those aspects that has made suppression seem reasonable? What are the things that produce the most disproportionate emotional reactions in me? And what is the honest question I should be asking about those reactions, rather than the story I usually tell about them? What have I dismissed as not for me, not in my nature, not who I am, and how much of that dismissal is actually accurate assessment versus adaptation to what was safe? These questions do not need to be answered in a single sitting. They are questions to live with, to let work on you over time, not to return to in the quiet moments when the persona is off duty and something less managed might be available. Jung believed deeply in the unconscious's desire to be known. He believed that the psyche tends toward wholeness, that there is something in every human being oriented toward the integration of its own full range, and that this orientation will generate signals, dreams, inexplicable reactions, moments of unusual clarity or unusual darkness that are always trying to show the conscious mind something it needs to see. The work is not to manufacture that process. It is to stop blocking it, to stop explaining away the signals as stress or circumstance or someone else's fault, and begin receiving them as information about your own interior territory. Writing is one of the most consistently effective practices for this kind of attention. Not performance writing, not the kind oriented toward an audience, real or imagined. Private writing, the kind Marcus Aurelius was doing in his meditations, that works on the questions that are actually alive for you at the edge of conscious understanding. The kind that follows a thread of honest inquiry, wherever it goes, rather than arriving at the reassuring conclusion you were looking for when you started. This kind of writing externalizes the interior in a way that makes it visible and therefore available to be examined. What was formless and uncomfortable inside becomes legible on a page, and therefore subject to your actual engagement, rather than your automatic defense. Yet the other practice Jung would have recognized as essential is the practice the Stoics also prescribed. Honest examination of your reactions, not the reactions themselves, the space between the stimulus and the response, in which the shadow is making its move. When you feel a disproportionate reaction rising, when you notice yourself triggered beyond what the situation seems to warrant, when you feel the specific heat of something that is more than the moment, stop. Not to suppress the reaction, to examine its source, to ask not what is happening out there, but what is happening in here, that this particular thing is activating in this particular way. That inquiry practiced consistently is one of the most direct paths into the shadow material that generates so much of the difficulty that most men attribute entirely to external causes. None of this is dramatic. It does not require a breakdown or a crisis or a formal therapeutic relationship, though any of those might serve it. It requires something simpler and in some ways harder, the consistent willingness to be honestly curious about your own interior life, to take yourself seriously enough as a subject to study you with the same rigor and the same honesty that you might bring to any other domain of genuine importance, to stop treating the interior life as something that will sort itself out if given enough external success, and begin treating it as the actual terrain on which everything that matters is either built or undermined. The integrated man, what Jung was pointing toward, and what the Stoic tradition calls something adjacent, though not identical to it, is the possibility of a man who is genuinely whole. Not perfect, not without darkness or limitation or ongoing difficulty, but whole in the sense of being in honest contact with the full range of what he is, who has metabolized enough of his shadow that it is no longer running him from behind the scenes, who wears the persona when the persona is genuinely useful, with the deliberate awareness that it is a social tool rather than an identity, who can take the mask off in private and increasingly in genuine relationship, and make contact with himself and with the people he cares about from the actual place of his actual self. That man moves differently through the world, not because he has resolved all his difficulties or healed all his wounds or achieved some philosophical completion that places him beyond the ordinary struggles of being human, but because his interior life and his exterior life are no longer fundamentally at odds, because he is not spending enormous energy maintaining a presentation that contradicts what he actually experiences, actually values, actually is, because the decisions he makes are coming from genuine contact with his own real preferences and real values, rather than from the automatic operation of a persona he inherited and never fully chose. The Stoics called this alignment, the state in which your reason, your emotion, and your action are moving in the same direction, in which what you think, what you feel, and what you do are integrated expressions of a unified self, rather than three separate systems running in parallel and frequently in conflict. Marcus Aurelius was pursuing exactly that integration in every line of his private writing. Not the appearance of a great emperor, but the actuality of a whole man who happened to be an emperor. Epictetus was describing exactly that integration when he talked about the freedom that comes from governing your own interior life. The freedom is not the absence of difficulty. It is the absence of the specific suffering that comes from being divided against yourself. That freedom is available to every man who is willing to look honestly at what the mask has been covering and to begin, however slowly and however imperfectly, the process of coming into contact with what was always underneath it, not because it is comfortable, because it is real, and the real life, for all its difficulty, is the only one that was ever actually worth living.